To Susan Neiman, the Einstein Forum, for the invitation to be here today. As it says in the booklet, I am an historian of the Enlightenment period. In fact, my current book project is a social and cultural history of the Enlightenment. I'm going to draw on different parts of the project in this talk. I'll try not to give a research report, that's not why we're here. What I want to try to do is to give a sense of what it means to talk about the Enlightenment from the perspective of the 18th century. In other words, to talk about the historical Enlightenment and how it can differ from the Enlightenment invoked today, both by the people who consider themselves the enemies of the Enlightenment and by some of the people who consider themselves its friends. And I'd like to actually start in what I hope is good Enlightenment fashion with some friendly but critical questions about the premises of this conference. It's very easy today to feel, as the conference literature suggests, that the Enlightenment is on trial, perhaps even under assault, at risk of being abandoned, and that it therefore needs to be defended. But what do we mean by the Enlightenment? What are we referring to when we say we want to defend it? To state an obvious point, the historical Enlightenment was in no sense a cohesive, coherent movement. It produced nothing like a cohesive, coherent ideology. Its major thinkers, in fact, like few things better than contradicting and criticizing each other, often quite brutally. The very labeled the Enlightenment, les Lumières, die Aufklärung, with a definite article, didn't enter into common usage until well after the 18th century. In English, really not until the 20th century. Intellectually, the Enlightenment is best thought of as a loose constellation of ideas, a kind of Venn diagram with many areas of intersection, but no union of all the sets. Now, the conference literature, drawing on Susan Neiman's terrific recent book, Left is Not Woke, particularly highlights three things it calls central to the Enlightenment. To quote, a commitment to universalism over tribalism, a belief in a hard distinction between justice and power, and a belief in the possibility of progress itself. But these things expressed in this way are, of course, not simple inheritances from the 18th century. They're not really original properties of the Enlightenment that have come down to us unchanged. They're certainly descended, at least in part, from that loose constellation of ideas I just mentioned. But they've been reworked by us after previous reworkings by a long chain of intermediary figures who stand between the 18th century and today. And they're each much more complicated than it might seem at first glance. Take, for instance, universalism. The French historian Antoine Lilti has very cogently argued that there's no single thing that we can call universalism. He's identified at least three separate strands, all of them traceable back not only to the Enlightenment, but even beyond the Enlightenment. In his account, there's a strand that could be called abstract universalism, a universalism grounded in an abstract set of values, principles that are distinct and removed from any particular cultural origin and against which everything can be measured. But there's also a universalism that takes a specific, supposedly usually advanced culture as its norm and measures everything against that. This is a universalism that could also be called an ethnocentrism, or most often a Eurocentrism. And finally, in Lilti's view, there's a third kind of universalism, which is a dialectical universalism, one that tries to develop a set of universal values from dialogues between actually existing cultures, from what Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in a lovely line, called the incessant interrogation of the self by the other and the other by the self. And Lilti has traced out the developments of all these different strands of universalism, first in the 18th century, but then he's shown how they were subsequently transformed, particularly in the French Revolution, which, of course, often sought to impose supposedly universal values on its neighbors at bayonet point. And since the French Revolution, these different strands of universalism have been transformed and contested again and again by liberal Christians, by socialists, by Anglo-American liberals, by French Republican imperialists, by communists, by many others, right down to the present-day uses of universalism as what can sometimes become a very loaded buzzword in the culture wars, I think particularly in France these days. So today when people speak of defending the Enlightenment, they may often imply that they're defending an unchanged inheritance from the 18th century. But they're actually defending something which is linked to the 18th century, but it's also, in a very real sense, their own invention. The same is true, of course, of those who criticize what they call the Enlightenment, and who then hold it responsible for all the ills of the modern world. In both cases, what is being invoked by the word enlightenment is not really a transparent window through which the 18th century is shining its light on us. It's more like a distorting mirror that is held up to our own modernity. Now, in one sense, I have no trouble at all defending an enlightenment which is as much a 21st century thing as an 18th century thing. Why not come up with our own version of enlightenment and defend that? I certainly believe in reason, in progress, in the distinction between justice and power, and yes, in a version of universalism. The problem is I'm not always sure how much sense it makes to argue for or against these values and ideas in the abstract. We don't attack or defend sets of ideas simply for their abstract value, but usually for their actual effects in the world. Today's critics of the Enlightenment mostly don't attack it because they dislike universalism in principle, but because they believe that in practice, Enlightenment universalism paved the way for modern racism and imperialism, and that it continues to underpin forms of racial and colonial oppression in the present. But trying to track the actual effects of ideas in the world, of course, leads us into many other labyrinths of difficulties. The connections can sometimes look obvious, but they're really not. A political actor holds up a particular thinker as an inspiration, but is that actually, can we simply say that the thinker inspired the actor, that the thinker's ideas became the actor's program, or is there a great distortion of the thinker at work here? Is the thinker just being held up as a convenient banner or being waved by somebody who really has no idea what they're talking about, as is often the case in politics? It's also, of course, all too easy to mistake correlation for causation, which is actually the fatal flaw in so many of the postmodern and postcolonial critiques of the Enlightenment. For example, many Enlightenment thinkers definitely had a mania for classification, especially of living things. Later racist thinkers had a mania for classifying human beings into superior and inferior races. But does this correlation imply causation? Was the Enlightenment the cause of modern racism, or is it more of a case of correlation without distinct causation? Again, it's not entirely clear. Now, as an historian, I'm committed to the idea that we can't hope to understand the effect of ideas in the world without reconstructing as fully as possible the social, the political, the cultural, the discursive contexts in which these ideas actually arose and circulated. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is to discuss two related contexts for the 18th century Enlightenment that have received, I think, relatively little attention from people today who are trying either to criticize or to defend the Enlightenment's heritage. And looking at these contexts helps us understand just how far I think we really are sometimes from the 18th century, and how much what we call defending the Enlightenment is actually defending a long liberal tradition that had an important starting point in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, but that has since evolved in some ways almost beyond recognition. So the first context I want to talk about is a context of struggle, because I think it is really crucial to remember the extent that the Enlightenment did exist as a coherent phenomenon in the 18th century, it was born in struggle and actually in violence, especially in much of Catholic Europe and also Catholic Latin America. Thinkers faced real dangers. Voltaire and Diderot were both imprisoned for their writings. Voltaire spent most of his career in exile from France, or just a hop, skip, and a jump across the border from friendly Geneva. Rousseau had to flee France and Switzerland, in the latter case after a mob attacked his home. The books of the philosophes were censored and burned. Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia was suppressed for quite a long time, had its publications stopped. In France and parts of Italy, throughout Spain and the Spanish Empire, people who were found trafficking or even just in possession of Enlightenment texts faced really severe punishment. So-called modern philosophy was routinely excoriated in the harshest possible terms by high officials in both church and state. Conspiracy theories abounded. There was a pamphlet which I like very much called Epistle from the Devil to Monsieur Voltaire, which accused Voltaire of being a literal Satanist, and it was republished over 30 times just between 1760 and 1789. And in fact, the historian Darren McMahon has, I think, very convincingly demonstrated that the first people who actually did conceive of the Enlightenment as a coherent, organized movement were not the philosophes themselves, but actually their enemies, particularly in the Catholic Church, who saw something they saw as the opposition. So in that sense, the Enlightenment being an invention of its enemies. So this history is well remembered, of course. But what's less well remembered is how the philosophes themselves would often respond to these attacks. Many chose the path of caution. Diderot, after being imprisoned at Vincennes in 1749, decided afterwards not to publish his most provocative and incendiary works. He simply preferred to circulate them in manuscript to close friends. As a result, we almost lost Rameau's Nephew, which was only even known in German translation for most of the 19th century. But others reacted by essentially trying to become a little bit what their critics accused them of being, namely an organized party bent on destroying the power of the established churches. Read the correspondence of Voltaire, especially from the 1760s. A lot of it actually sounds a lot like the work of a party organizer, of a man struggling to coordinate the work of loyal followers. It sounds like somebody who's at war. Here is a letter from Voltaire to d'Alembert, 1761. I'll quote, "Oh, my philosophe, you need to march in close order like a Macedonian phalanx. The true philosophers need to form a confraternity just like the Freemasons. You need to come together, support each other, pledge fidelity to the confraternity itself." And then 2 years later, when this hadn't really happened, he wrote to d'Alembert, I'm quoting, "I'm afraid that you and your companions are not sufficiently zealous. You bury your talents and are content with despising a monster that you should be struggling to abhor and to destroy." And of course, he signed his letters with the phrase, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush that which is infamous, in other words, the Catholic Church. After the French Revolution, there was a guy, a Jesuit named Augustin Baruel, who tried to prove that the French Revolution had been a direct product of a philosophical conspiracy. It's often assumed that Baruel was simply making stuff up the way conspiracy theorists do, that he was trafficking in fake news. He actually wasn't. His first volume, which runs many hundreds of pages, draws entirely on published sources, mostly the printed correspondence of the major philosophes, and his footnotes are accurate. The philosophes did often sound conspiratorial, and for good reason, because they thought they were at war. Now, in the decades before the French Revolution, the persecution of the Enlightenment did slacken. The philosophes succeeded in infiltrating many of the most prestigious European cultural institutions. D'Alembert became recording secretary of the Académie Française. But the writings did not necessarily turn more moderate, in many cases quite the reverse. They even became bellicose. Baron d'Holbach, who was one of the most popular authors of the late Enlightenment, his System of Nature topped the list of illegal French bestsellers, and much of his work is nothing but a call for the destruction of the Christian churches and the overturning of the European social order. I'll quote a passage from d'Holbach from 1773 from his Système Social. "Throughout the world we see nothing but rulers who are unjust, incompetent, softened by luxury, corrupted by flattery, depraved by debauch and impunity, utterly lacking in talent, morality, and virtue, neglecting their duties to fight useless wars or to slake their insatiable greed, plus ça change. The state of society is a war, to continue, the state of society is a war of the sovereign against everyone else. These monsters who order or contemplate such horrors with a dry eye, they must perish." So this is the first context I wanted to call attention to, this context of struggle and violence in which the historical Enlightenment emerged, and the sense on the part of many of its most important authors that they were engaged in a form of relentless combat against merciless enemies. Now, for the second context, I think the most important element here is actually something of an absence, which is an absence of something we take very much for granted in liberal societies today, namely pluralism, by which I mean simply the idea that groups with different interests and even with different value systems can and should be able to coexist in the same society, with the state taking their differences into account, mediating between them if necessary, guiding them towards compromise. It's a value absolutely central to our conception of a free and just society today. But when did pluralism of this sort really emerge in Western societies? I would argue that it mostly did only in the wake of the democratic revolutions of the 18th and early 19th centuries. When representative governments took root and learned how to function effectively, it was bound up intimately with what we call liberalism. But it's something that was, I think, largely absent from the broad political culture of Western societies in the 18th century, and so from Enlightenment thought as well. Now, when I'm speaking of the absence of pluralism, I don't mean to say that Enlightenment thinkers couldn't value and appreciate cultural difference. They definitely could. The historian Sankar Muthu, in his book Enlightenment Against Empire, has shown very convincingly that some of the most important Enlightened figures, Herder, Kant, Diderot, believed, and I'm quoting him, that the category of the human is necessarily marked by cultural difference, and that also, and I'm quoting again, many practices and beliefs lie outside the bounds of a categorical judgment or universal standard. Close quote. On this basis, these authors were able, among other things, to condemn slavery and European imperialism. But this entirely admirable and original recognition of pluralism between peoples didn't necessarily extend to a recognition and acceptance of pluralism within peoples, within single polities. That was a very different matter and was seen as much more intractable and indeed much more dangerous. Pluralism, I think I also need to stress, is something very distinct from simply the toleration or even the encouragement of different opinions and ideas, as in the kind of public discourse that Fintan O'Toole was talking about yesterday. Toleration was, of course, something absolutely central to Enlightenment thought. Among the philosophes and those who followed them, it was widely held that society should encourage free expression, both because human beings have a right to think and speak and worship as they please, but also because only through free exchange and debate can the best ideas really take shape, be tested, and come to the fore. But where are the limits of this? Does it imply pluralism? Does it imply the existence, the continued competing existence of ideas into the political sphere? Consider these words from one of the most enlightened figures of the 18th century, a good man of the Enlightenment. As a 24-year-old, he wrote, and I quote, "The liberty innate in man should be accorded him as far as possible." And then 16 years later, he proclaimed, and I'm quoting again, "Every lover of truth must rejoice to be told the truth, even if it is conveyed to him via the uncomfortable route of criticism." Close quote. So great Enlightenment statements here. But the person in question was Joseph II, the Emperor of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. He was a man who certainly loosened the severe censorship apparatus he inherited from his predecessors. No pluralist. He ruled as an absolute monarch. His motto was, "Everything exists for the state." In fact, during his reign, he cut back enormously on the authority of intermediary bodies. He concentrated power more and more at the imperial center with him. The purpose of free expression, in his view, was above all to generate the best possible ideas for the flourishing of the state. But there was only one final judge of what constituted the best possible ideas, him. And once he had decided, his judgment would be absolute and final. There was no question in his mind of giving any credit afterwards to competing opinions or trying to mediate compromises with groups with different opinions and different value systems. And there are a lot of other examples of this in the 18th century. To briefly mention just one, the detailed governmental reform plans devised by another great man of the Enlightenment, France's finance minister Anne-Robert Turgot, in the mid-1770s. This was a plan for a complex series of French assemblies, and it looks almost like a sketch for representative government, for representative democracy, except that these assemblies had a purely consultative function. They were meant to convey opinions and information and ideas to the king, and then the king would have the sole authority to act. So this conception of freedom of speech, as distinct from political pluralism, wasn't only held by people who believed in so-called enlightened despotism. It was even, I think, implicit in at least some writings of Immanuel Kant, such as his great essay, What is Enlightenment? I mentioned this very briefly yesterday. Kant made in this great essay a distinction between what he called, somewhat confusingly to my students, the public and private uses of reason. The first referred to people speaking as disinterested members of a universal community, as scholars, and it was supposed to be, and here speech was supposed to be entirely unfettered. As Kant wrote, it alone can bring about enlightenment, Aufklärung, among human beings. But then there was the private use of reason that referred very often to people speaking in their capacity as officials in one way or another. And to quote Kant again here, it is certainly impermissible to argue. Instead, one must obey. So in other words, even an almost unlimited extent of free speech did not necessarily give citizens the right to oppose the explicit commands of their sovereign, and that sovereign was under no obligation to defer in any way to their views. Kant noted in an aside in the essay, and what was a pretty clear and I think even possibly approving reference to Frederick the Great, here we are in Potsdam, quote, "Only one ruler in the world says, argue as much as you will and about whatever you want, but obey." Now, Enlightenment political thought obviously varied enormously. It could range from Frederick's enlightened absolutism to Rousseau's concept of radically democratic sovereignty and much, much, much else. Many authors insisted that sovereign power could, in fact, only derive from the consent of the people. Many of them called for limits or restraints on that power, on sovereign power. Many, writing in the classical Republican tradition, sought to actually find out ways to institute limits on power, to institute restraints, often through creating a mixed or balanced constitution, even through what we would call a separation of powers. But restraining or limiting sovereign power didn't mean the same thing as dividing sovereign power, of forcing sovereign authority to act in such a way, again, as to reconcile competing interests and value systems. Even if the sovereign authority was democratic, as in Rousseau's social contract, it was still unitary. Its actions could be restrained and limited, perhaps. Intermediary institutions could force it to act with deliberation and care, but that was different from putting pressure on the sovereign to change course, from having the sovereign acknowledge a plurality of interests and values in the state and to defer to them. And in practice, Enlightenment authors nearly always assumed that even if they did have this theoretical belief in democratic sovereignty, or if they had this theoretical belief in classical republicanism, in practice, any hope for rational enlightened reform in the Europe and the European society, the European colonial societies of their day, what would it depend on? It would depend on finding a rational, enlightened, hereditary monarch to actually put it into action. I quote, for example, the great Swiss educational reformer Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi. Quote, "I have set my hopes on finding a king who is a friend of mankind and the father of his people. It's a humiliating thought, but true. Any advance in the good leadership of people must proceed from the cabinet of monarchs." Or I could go back to my friend Baron d'Holbach in the final words of the social system. And this is somebody as radical as possible when it came to wanting to overthrow the social system. And yet he also wrote, "Princes, legislators, sovereigns, masters of the world, it's to you that it belongs to endow men with morality. You hold men's minds in your hands, and following the voice of truth, you will become tutelary gods of your subjects," close quote. And we can find similar sentiments actually uttered by Voltaire, who of course was friendly with Frederick the Great and wrote an admiring biography of Peter the Great of Russia. Diderot would move in this direction, particularly when he gladly accepted the invitation to travel to St. Petersburg to meet with Catherine the Great, many other philosophes. In 1770, Voltaire wrote to D'Alembert to describe the way a friend of the philosophes had been hounded to his death by the Archbishop of Toulouse. And Voltaire called this yet another persecution of what he jokingly referred to as our little primitive church. But he then added, "But look who we have on our side. We have the Empress Catherine, we have the King of Prussia, we have the King of Denmark, the Queen of Sweden, and many princes of the Holy Roman Empire." Voltaire, too, could ultimately put his faith in princes. So that's the second context, the relative unintelligibility in the 18th century of what we today generally take for granted as liberal pluralism, and the broadly shared sense at the time in the 18th century that enlightened reform, even if it might originally be generated from below, from the free exchange of ideas in some sort of public sphere, would still ultimately depend on the will of a sovereign, most likely a hereditary monarch, to become reality. Now, these two contexts, the perception of philosophy being engaged in an existential struggle, the ultimate dependence of enlightenment on the will of a unitary sovereign, would of course, powerfully reinforce each other at the time, particularly, of course, in the minds of sovereigns themselves. Let me quote here an extraordinary letter that Frederick the Great, again, here we're in Potsdam, I can't resist quoting him, that Frederick the Great wrote to Voltaire in 1775, speaking of what we would now call the Enlightenment. So Frederick wrote, "We owe this ongoing revolution of the mind, révolution de l'esprit, to Bayle, your predecessor, and to you yourself. But let's speak frankly, it's not complete. The devout have their party, and they will never be finished off without force majeure, violence. The decree that crushes the infamous thing once and for all can only come from a government. Enlightened ministers can contribute a great deal, but the will of the sovereign has to be there as well." Close quote. So what are some of the implications of these two contexts for the way that Enlightenment ideas actually made their way into the world? Most importantly, we have to recognize how deeply these ideas could be compatible with and could actually help to promote what was actually an authoritarian and illiberal politics. And this goes against many of the classic Whiggish historical narratives that, of course, cast the Enlightenment as the birthplace of modern liberal democracy. The historian Peter Gay, for instance, who drew a straight line from the Enlightenment's science of freedom, as he called it, to the American Revolution. Or more recently, Jonathan Israel, who has insisted at pretty great length that the so-called radical Enlightenment found its fullest political expression in the short-lived democracy of France's First Republic. Now, my point is not to refute these narratives, which have a great deal of sense to them, but I want to point out that they exist in profound tension with another narrative, one that is actually centered not on the coming of democracy, but on the lure of charismatic, enlightened, absolute leaders. Obviously, as I've just said, Enlightenment authors often place their faith in hereditary monarchs, like Frederick or Joseph or Catherine. But then, particularly as the Enlightenment gave way, if we can say that, to the Age of Revolution, Enlightenment works also helped to stimulate a different kind of what could almost be called a virtual cult around new, heroic, non-hereditary strongmen whose supposedly extraordinary abilities and whose devotion to the public good would, in theory, allow them to rule by popular acclamation, who'd be capable of imposing progressive and rational reforms without having to observe pedantic constitutional niceties, just like hereditary monarchs. And this is something I wrote about quite a lot in my recent book, Men on Horseback. I talked about first how Enlightenment era audiences were first captivated by a figure who's now largely forgotten but was incredibly important in the 18th century, the Corsican leader Pasquale Paoli. I'll quote the way one of his most prominent admirers, James Boswell, described him. Quote, "Paoli sways the hearts of his countrymen. His power knows no bounds. It is high treason so much as to speak against him. He exercises a species of despotism, but it is founded, contrary to the principles of Montesquieu, on the affection of love." And one of my arguments in the book was that this ideal of a charismatic leader exercising benevolent despotism over a willing and loving people would actually soon help to legitimize the rule of numerous authoritarians who swept to power after early experiments in revolutionary democracy collapsed. Bonaparte in France, Toussaint Louverture, and his successors in Haiti, Simón Bolívar in South America, and many of the so-called Caesarist rulers of the 19th century. And it's really quite a misnomer to call the age of revolutions the age of democratic revolution when so few of the democracies actually succeeded, and when so often what happened was very quickly the coming to power of charismatic strongmen. Another tension, which I think is revealed when we explore these two contexts, is the one in Enlightenment thought and writing between what I would call the will towards self-cultivation on the one hand and the will towards prescription on the other. So I just want to spend a moment talking about that as well. On the one hand, a lot of Enlightenment writing is very clearly aimed at giving, and the most admirable part of it, is aimed at giving readers the ability to come to their own judgments about important moral and political matters, if you will, to enhance their personal autonomy. Of course, far more than in earlier centuries, or later ones for that matter, the 18th century was a time when authors of the most profound and challenging works of thought wrote as accessibly as possible for an expanding and anonymous public. And far more than their predecessors, they pushed their readers actively to engage with their text and using all sorts of interesting stylistic means to do this, such as writing texts in the form of puzzles, games, mysteries, paradoxes, Voltaire's stories, which often depend on what one literary scholar has called moments of puzzlement, which are basically prompting the reader to work out the solution before the author reveals it. Diderot adored the dialogue form, of course, forcing his readers to evaluate apparently opposing viewpoints. Montesquieu wrote in an often deliberately disordered way, but hinted that there was a secret chain, as he put it, but didn't explain, that linked the apparently disorganized chapters of his Persian letters. The Encyclopedia invited readers to follow a trail from volume to volume through the editor's playful cross-references, including the famous cross-reference I can't resist mentioning for the article on cannibalism. At the end, see also Holy Communion. So Voltaire summed up the spirit of this kind of Enlightenment writing in the preface to his philosophical dictionary when he wrote, quote, "The most useful books are the ones that the readers write half of themselves," an absolutely lovely line. And, of course, in addition, Enlightenment authors did as much as any group of authors in modern history to develop the genre of what we would now call cultural criticism, guides for how to develop taste, how to appreciate painting, theater, fiction, music. So in short, there was a current of Enlightenment writing, and a really important and admirable one, dedicated to giving at least an educated public the opportunity to enlighten itself. But in tension with this, there existed another current that was much more prescriptive and much more dogmatic. Baron d'Holbach exemplifies this current, but he's certainly not the only one, and many of the major philosophes would go in this direction at many times. But just to stick with d'Holbach for a moment, I've already quoted his insistence that the progress of enlightenment depended on the actions of princes. But throughout his many, long, repetitive, often pedantic, but really influential books, he didn't only assume that humanity needed to bring about the reign of reason and truth. He insisted that under this reign of reason and truth, there would be basically one right answer to the great questions of politics, morality, social organization, and that it was the responsibility of the state to impose these right answers on its citizenry, whatever, by force if necessary. So, for these reasons, the context I've been discussing, I think they raise questions about some of the elements of enlightenment that have been highlighted for this conference. Take, for instance, the belief in progress. To put the question quite simply, progress achieved how? Susan Neiman, in a recent book, defends Enlightenment visions of progress against postmodern critics in wonderful passages, but I can't help but note that she refers, and I quote, to the idea that people can work together to make significant improvements in the real conditions of their own and others' lives, exactly how we would describe progress today. But is it the way that Enlightenment figures would necessarily have imagined progress as taking place? More common was the assumption that progress was something, first, that had to be fought for against vicious enemies, and that it would often have to be imposed from above by what Frederick the Great, in the letter I quoted, called force majeure, by the will, necessarily even the repressive will, of a sovereign. And again, the sovereign didn't have to be a single individual. It could be a democratic collective, as in Rousseau's social contract. But even then, its decisions, once arrived at, would no longer be subject to debate, to modification, to legitimate opposition, because opposition could be seen as divisive, as faction, even as treason. To come back to important late Enlightenment thinkers like d'Holbach or Condorcet, for that matter, they most certainly believed in progress. When it came to progress in the arts and sciences, they believed that progress could, in fact, come about by itself. But progress in the political and social spheres was different. Here, again, these philosophes could become dogmatic, prescriptive, and from our perspective, intolerant, even repressive. Progress would emanate from the sovereign will, and as Condorcet put it, and I'm quoting him, it had to, quote, embrace the whole economy of society, change every social relation, penetrate to the smallest link of the political chain. From there, it is only a step to the French First Republic in which he served, and which very quickly devolved into a reign of terror. Now, the context I've been discussing, I think, also have some implications, as I think I've already hinted, for the long-term story of Enlightenment universalism. Now, as I've already mentioned, certain Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Kant, I think, developed incredibly powerful forms of abstract universalism that were tied to the belief that all human beings basically have a similar nature. Certain writers, including Kant again, managed to balance this abstract universalism with a recognition of and a respect for cultural difference, which led them, among other things, to oppose imperialism and slavery. But again, as Sankar Muthu has noted, this moment of what he calls enlightenment against empire was pretty distressingly short-lived. 19th century heirs to the Enlightenment, Hegel, Marx, Tocqueville, Mill, all had far more sympathy with imperialist projects. It wasn't that they believed that non-European peoples were innately inferior to Europeans. Rather, they believed that these peoples belonged to an earlier stage of social evolution than Europeans, a stage at which they were not yet capable of rational self-government. So imperialism would be necessary, even for Marx, because it would bring these people into history and lift them up the scale. And did they have a guilty conscience about imperialism, as Susan suggested yesterday? In some cases, yes. In some cases, I'm not so sure. And I can't help but note a terrible irony here, that at precisely the moment that the notion of liberal pluralism within states was becoming much more acceptable and thinkable in Western practice and thought, the notion of pluralism between peoples and states, which Diderot, Herder, and Kant had all endorsed in their works, went into eclipse. So why was this the case? Well, we have to remember, of course, that the subtle and attractive universalism of Diderot, Herder, and Kant was hardly the only form of universalism on offer in Enlightenment thought. It had to compete with a much more deeply Eurocentric form of universalism, which already in the 18th century might have recognized that there was a single human nature, but which also placed all human societies on a single linear scale of evolution from primitive to civilized. What Condorcet did not hesitate to call the most enlightened peoples, he did not mean people outside of Europe, would naturally provide the standard against to measure everyone else. And this was the universalism expressed in the great conjectural histories of Condorcet, but also of Voltaire, of Adam Ferguson, of many other great Enlightenment authors. And Voltaire, with his great multi-volume essay sur les mœurs, the essay on customs, is particularly interesting, I think, here. Because the story, this is a huge book of Voltaire. It's not read very much today. It should be. It's wonderfully readable and funny, among other things. But the story that he told was not simply one of evolution, from hunter-gatherers to feudalism to modern commercial society. It was a story of combat. Progress was being opposed at every stage by enemies, by the infamous thing. And all across the world, too. In his chapters on Europe, the enemies were very obvious: the Christian churches, ignorant, superstitious, intolerant, persecuting. But his chapters on China were exactly the same. Here, the good guys were the rational Confucians, the sensible ones, but then there were bad guys, the Buddhists, with their monasteries and their fighting monks, whom he cast basically as kind of Asian Catholics. And Voltaire had very harsh things to say about many other groups, such as the Jews, whom he denounced as clannish, superstitious, willfully opposed to Enlightenment values. So in other words, the same sense of an existential combat that permeated his correspondence also infused his universalism. And a twisted criticism of what we might today call, his criticism of what we could now call communitarianism or tribalism, into something that was, in fact, pretty explicitly Eurocentric and, yes, racist and anti-Semitic. And this wasn't incidental to his work. It wasn't something overshadowed by the grand achievements, and he did have grand achievements. It was, though, central to his thinking. And he was, of course, by far the most famous and probably the most influential Enlightenment writer, if perhaps not the greatest. I wouldn't call anybody but Kant the greatest here in Germany. But it's no surprise that, but Voltaire may have very well been much more influential, particularly at the time. And it's no surprise that in the Age of Revolution, especially the French Revolution, it was Voltaire's universalism that enjoyed the greatest success by far. In the years after 1789, one of the few things that revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries tended to agree on was that the revolution had been caused by what both sides called philosophy. Would that philosophy had such influence today? The counter-revolutionaries saw it as a shadow that had fallen on the tranquil garden of the old regime, corrupting vulnerable minds and leading the French people into orgies of sacrilege and slaughter. The revolutionaries basically just reversed the image, casting philosophy as a beam of light that had fallen on a blasted plain and guided the French towards freedom and equality. And they celebrated the philosophes as their inspirations. They reburied both Voltaire and Rousseau in the Pantheon with great pomp. So in other words, they saw themselves directly continuing Voltaire's existential struggle. And not surprisingly, they overwhelmingly adopted his version of universalism, seeing their own values, which they now called revolutionary values, as something that did need to be imposed by the French on the French nation itself and then on the rest of Europe by force if people resisted. So these contexts, I think, do matter less for the third element of Enlightenment thought that's mentioned in the conference literature and discussed in Susan's book, namely the hard distinction between justice and power. Here, I think we can actually trace much more of a straight line from the 18th century to the present. Of course, we can't credit the Enlightenment with entirely inventing the distinction, but Enlightenment thinkers, above all Montesquieu, I think here, did mark a crucial advance in developing a theoretical understanding of what it meant to have power without justice. This was his theory of despotism, which political writers had previously, for the most part, considered as a corrupt form of monarchy, but which Montesquieu raised up into one of the three fundamental forms of government, along with republics and monarchies. And what distinguished despotism for him and for many other Enlightenment thinkers who wrote about it, interestingly, was not, as we might think today, the degree of control that the despotic ruler exercised. It was rather the nature of that control, the fact that it was arbitrary and personal. Arbitrary in that the despot ruled by whim and caprice, and personal in that he considered the entire state his own property. As I've already mentioned, many Enlightenment thinkers were in fact quite happy with very intrusive forms of absolute government, such as by Frederick the Great or Joseph II, but only if it were rational and rule-based, if it were for the benefit of the state rather than the person of the monarch, grounded in the abstraction of the state rather than the person of the monarch. I think today our expansive notions of individual liberty make us far less likely to accept such intrusive forms of government, but we still cling, or we should cling, to the distinction between justice and power that the Enlightenment thinkers expressed so clearly. So I'll just say a few words here of conclusion. It hasn't been my intention, in this paper, to offer an indictment of the Enlightenment. As I said, I think that such a thing has very little meaning or purpose. I certainly don't want to repeat the postmodern or postcolonial critics in that sense. And it's not either been my intention to call into question the defense of Enlightenment values of the sort exemplified by the work of many people who are here today. My intention has been just much more modestly to offer a reminder that the historical Enlightenment, in all its complexity, in all its ambiguity, in all its ambivalence, was still a very different thing, as I began with, from the modern representations of it that some want to burn in effigy and others want to put on a pedestal. My intention has also been to offer a second reminder, namely that if we do put the Enlightenment back in its full historical context, we can see that ideas like universalism and progress, which sound so attractive and even so simple to us, could play out in the world of the 18th century in ways that were in fact rigidly prescriptive, even intolerant, even repressive. Critics of these tendencies in the Enlightenment have not been entirely wrong. The most attractive of ideas can have a double edge to them. So, in short, what we today should be championing as Enlightenment ideas are not the ideas of the Enlightenment. They are ideas from the Enlightenment, ideas that have subsequently been tempered, challenged, and transformed by 2.5 centuries of subsequent experience, especially the Western world's long and very difficult experiments with representative democracy and with liberal pluralism. So when we say we want to defend the Enlightenment, to hold it up as a beacon to follow, to put it on trial and come up with a verdict of innocent, we should make absolutely clear that it is not the 18th century Enlightenment that we're talking about, it's the 21st century Enlightenment. It's our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Now we have plenty of time for questions, and I've got Susan and Stephen on my list. Eva and I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Gottfried. Gottfried. Can I have the mic, please? Yes. So, is it on? No. Is somebody turn it on, please? Hello? Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. David, thank you very much for an unsurprisingly interesting paper, surprisingly direct encounter with my own thought. So I want to take a moment to reflect on that and see if there's any place that we can come to agreement, because I think we probably can. I should say as a start, your remarks about Enlightenment thinkers putting their faiths in various kinds of monarchs that they didn't or couldn't choose reminded me just a bit of our conversation this morning in the hotel about Joe Biden's latest speech. I mean, let's be fair, okay? The people like us tend actually not to be in positions of power to make those kinds of choices. But okay. Your paper brought out for me some really strong differences between the habitus of philosophers and the habitus of historians. And before I go on, I should say that it occurred to me just a couple of years ago that I count among my friends and people with whom I regularly engage with more historians than philosophers. I always feel like, you know, I've talked to a historian, you usually wind up having learned something, and that's not always the case with philosophers. So this is by no means a dump on historians, but it is to note that there's a gesture that is absolutely, the proper gesture of historians, which is always to say, it's all more complicated than you think it is, okay? And the gesture of philosophers, I think, even when we're not doing explicitly ethics or political philosophy, is in some sense inherently normative, okay? And of course, all of those things, I know that all of those things, I've read quite a lot of history about the Enlightenment, and I've even written much longer books than that little book. My goal there was to write a short book, and I do know that things are much more complicated, but I'm thinking of the kind of abstraction that the Enlightenment was able to make to the human, which of course Foucault said the 18th century invented the idea of the human, and he sees that as a problem. I actually see it as an achievement that there was an ability not to say that all human beings are fundamentally the same. I don't know which philosopher said that. Nobody occurs to me at the moment, but I'm sure you may come up with some examples. But to abstract from the appearances of all of the variety of human beings and to say there's something that we want to see as an essential humanity which is the bearer, or should be the bearer, of dignity, with all the differences in appearance. And I want to see if we can do that. That seems to me to be a philosophical way of taking these various ideas of the Enlightenment and saying, yeah, I get it. Of course there were lots of Enlightenments. Of course they were always fighting with each other. But, and this is a point you said that was interesting, especially interesting, the very notion of there being an Enlightenment was something that was basically invented by their enemies. And what I was doing in that little book was to try to respond to what I think are genuine enemies at the moment, and I'll just name the concepts that I think, yes, of course, universalism is complicated, but we're living in an age where what matters is tribalism, otherwise known as positionality. And we're living in an age in which people say, a vast majority, Finton was talking about postmodernism, one can also talk about postcolonialism, any claim to make a distinction between justice and power is just bullshit. It's all hypocrisy. And yes, of course, progress is bloody and complicated, and Kant even thought the French Revolution was, the view of the French Revolution, which he knew perfectly well was bloody and complicated by the time that he said it. That was his example of progress. Nobody that I ever read thought of it as some simple, road to the Wizard of Oz with the sun shining over. Maybe the passage of D'Holbach. D'Holbach is the one who seems to me to be the most problematic about a rosy view of progress. But what we're living in an age where more people's view of progress has been influenced by Foucault's discipline and punish to take, one of the great early achievements of the Enlightenment, doing away with public execution by torture, and walk away concluding that actually every attempt to make progress is just a more subtle form of domination. So if you and then the final one is just the difference between reason and positionality. The idea that what matters are not your arguments, but your standing point. So I think yes, of course, it's 18th century thinkers refined and read through and taking the best of principle of charity, taking the best of those thoughts and using that to define a position which I do think very much needs defending.
Thank you. And I agree with a great deal of what you've said there, but I would reply that the complexities really matter. Because the devil is in the details here, as are the angels. They're in the details. And just to come back to this question of tribalism, for instance, and universalism, the idea of how you actually develop a truly abstract universalism that does not simply reflect your own positionality is actually incredibly difficult. And that by saying that, there's universalism and there's tribalism and making it sound like it's so obviously opposed, that there's a certain danger there because it becomes wielded by a lot of people who will then, who are then attacked, I think, quite rightly for basically this is simply their own version of positionality. This is, they're saying, we are more advanced than you are. Where's the Tolstoy of the Zulus? I mean, and oh no, nobody's saying that anymore. But there's okay, but precisely the reason nobody is saying that anymore is because there was pushback. And Foucault, it's a question of how we judge Foucault. I mean, yes, of course, you can say that it goes way too far in saying that every step of progress is simply another enslavement and domination. But wasn't he right to point out that the underside of a lot of these reforms and changes, when we look at the carceral state today and when we look at the way a lot of things function around the world? I'm not sure he was. It was, you don't have to agree with him entirely. You don't have to take his points about the human entirely to not to appreciate what he actually achieved in calling attention to some of the underlying dynamics in these things. I don't think so, not at all. So again, my response would be that yes, I think maybe this is a question of the habitus of historians and philosophers. I am an historian. I'm not too old to change at this point, but I do think that again, what interests me again is very much the complexities and the way that these evolved and the way that they actually informed actual political action and all of the undersides, all of the unexpected after effects and counter effects of what seemed to be the very easy and very normative, very easy and attractive statement of normative principle.
So the next question is Stephen. I'm extending my list as we go. So if you want to raise a question, just put your hand up.
That was great. So thanks. I'm going to ask a little about this, the monarchs, the deference to monarch to power. Sometimes you seem to say that there's a cult of the man on horseback, or maybe the cult of their own sinecures and their pensions and so on. On the other hand, you said there was a kind of clear belief that in a society where the church has so much power, you had to have a counterpower. And that wasn't going to come from people sitting around in seminar rooms. So, and I think part of this Susan's anti-power kind of talk, when a problem disappears, then the solution doesn't seem to have any meaning anymore. But for them, this power was a solution to their problem, which we don't have anymore. It's like, those natural history museums that come up in a world were built in Christian societies, and now they're sitting there, no one knows why they're there. So it's a lot of their thinking shouldn't be judged. I'm kind of stressing your contextual point. But then there's an additional turn, which is, it seems like because these thinkers are in conflict with religion, with superstition, with clerical power, they probably are imitative. That is, they see that the force they're against is dogmatic, intolerant, aggressive, arrogant, and they take over a lot of those characteristics, which would lead, of course, this is the great sociological question, to the conclusion that if you transfer enlightenment to a country that doesn't have a king, doesn't have a nobility, doesn't have a church, it's a very different kind of thing, and it doesn't have the same tendency to sacralize itself the way. Does that make sense to you?
I think it does make sense. I mean, I think I agree with all of that. I think, though, that it's. I mean, there is a tendency on the part of enlightenment, of people who believe in their own enlightenment, to find enemies, to look for enemies, partly because of this heritage that they've inherited of fighting against the churches, of fighting against the devout, of fighting. So that's one thing I would say. I guess, and actually, just to come back to Susan's point about Biden, I mean, yeah, we still to a certain extent we obviously put our faith in princes. We have nowhere else to put them, but at least in theory, we are choosing them, and at least in theory, they're. I mean, I live in New York, so do I have a vote for president? Not really. Any case, but and I think I mean, and this is to actually come back to what Susan was saying, and which I agree with, is that there are still lots of, I mean, even in societies where there are not these established powers, there are other powers that certainly come up. And in the United States, there's a very long and very deep power of established religion or of evangelical religion. If we just have to look at what's happening today in Louisiana and Oklahoma, with the order that the Ten Commandments be displayed in every classroom in Louisiana, that the students in Oklahoma have to study the Bible, in public school. I mean, there's still l'enfant est toujours là, hein? I mean, to a certain extent. So I think that the people who consider themselves, as inheritors of the Enlightenment tradition will still find a lot of things to struggle against. I just hope they struggle in the right way.
Eva, the mic is coming over.
Thank you for absolutely marvelous paper, from which I learned a great deal. My question is totally naive. I take the Enlightenment, as you said, to be about opposition to arbitrary authority and to be about an expanded notion of humanity. Therefore, it's not surprising, I think, to see it, and I think Susan would agree with that, as orienting the broad sensibility of the left, what we call the left. This is where my question is. So given that your paper is about intellectual filiations, as we read them or misread them, the left has often been divided broadly into two lefts. Let's say the one that is impatient for change, radical and violent, which calls for violence, that is, and a one that respects institutions and procedures and is more slow to change. I naively attributed the second left to the Enlightenment, and the first left to kind of, deviation, however you want to call it, from the first left. Your paper suggests that, in fact, this way of dividing them is, well, of course, naive and wrong. And what I found really unsettling and very challenging in your reading is maybe, or tell me if I misread you, that in fact there already was in that sensibility a kind of accommodation with the idea of violence that would not be without reminding us of the accommodation, more than accommodation, with violence of the Bolsheviks or of the anti-colonialists, which, Sartre, for example, endorsed. So
Eva,
that's my question.
Eva, could you just pass it forward to Yafrid over here? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Should I respond or should I?
Just no response.
Yeah, no, respond, okay.
I was just trying to save a bit of
Okay,
time.
no. So, so thank you for the question. I mean, I'm always a little bit hesitant about sort of these neat divisions of different lefts. I think that, or talking, I mean, or dividing, for example, Enlightenment into moderate and radical Enlightenment. Jonathan Israel, whom I mentioned in the lecture, has tried at an inordinate length to put a very clear distinction in the Enlightenment between the radicals, who were the good guys, and the moderates, who were sort of the trimmers, and the compromisers, who would go along with power. And I think a great deal, I think Stephen Holmes put it really well. I mean, a lot depends on the situation that you're in. I always remember, an argument I had in college where one friend of mine was actually defending the arms buildup of the 1980s, and somebody else said, well, what do you believe in? Guns or butter? And he said, well, that depends whether I'm starving or under attack. And it's a good example of, there are moments when a large group of the left would come together to engage in violence because they felt there was no other course possible. So I think it really does depend.
Intellectual filiation. It was not about situation.
Right.
About genealogies. Intellectual.
Well, but as I said, I mean, I think you can find. I mean, again, it's very tricky if you look at individual authors. I mean, to look, for example, even at somebody like Kant. For instance, Kant writes his proposal for perpetual peace. And you think of him as a great defender of sort of the values of peace and humanity, but then he, I think it's in the, I can't remember which work it's in off the top of my head, but there is a place where he says, it's only war that brings out what's truly human in us. So, societies that are perpetually at peace are feeble and effeminate. So I think people could go in all sorts of directions. I don't think it's easy to put that kind of dividing line in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, may I connect to your questions regarding violence? And in fact, isn't have a question to you as a historian. I mean, the French Revolution, as we all know, could not exist without Enlightenment. You know, the Enlightenment led or helped the French Revolution, but and the progress there was also a progress in killing people. We know that the guillotine, I mean, to kill people by sword takes a lot much longer time than killing them, you know, by the guillotine. And there was another form of progress in killing people. That was les noyades. You know this? There were people were put on boats, and these boats were then sunk, which made it possible to kill hundreds of people at the same time. So this was some. It seems to me this is also part of this revolution, and of course this continued in later revolutions by the communists, and the last example would be Pol Pot in Cambodia. So how do you see this connection between violence and revolution and, progress?
Again, it comes back to what I was talking about, I think in the lecture, when I tried to be cautious about about establishing intellectual genealogies between, theoretical writings on the one hand and intellectual writings on the one hand and political action on the other. There's a great deal that goes into explaining the terror in the French Revolution, whether or not it is, quote, the influence, close quote, of the Enlightenment as opposed to many other things going on in France in the early 1790s, I think is again, to come back to what I was saying today, it's complicated. So I think part of the problem that we have there is that, as I said in the lecture, I mean, when both revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries wanted to explain why the French Revolution had come about, they both said, well, it's obvious, philosophy. They pointed to texts like D'Holbach's, they pointed to Voltaire, they pointed to Rousseau, and they said, obviously this was going to lead to revolution, obviously the revolution was caused by this. Was it? I mean, these people were read in large parts of Europe without revolution breaking out there. So I think it's again, complicated.
Ben.
I appreciate the attempt to situate the 18th century Enlightenment in the 18th century, but I think that some of the meanderings outside it, and I speak as a historian, not a philosopher, remind me of the methodology of a magpie, which is a kind of picking and choosing of the things that make your contrasts clearer. And I think that's also something that's happened a little bit in the Q&A. Like the great god that would not drink nectar but from the skull of its enemies, doesn't sound like a support for the progressive role of colonialism. But Mill and Marx come in the same page. And as for the rest, if we agree there isn't an Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment, and we want the complexity, then I'm wondering whether we needed quite so many references to how we see it today, because then it could, of course, be a merely historicist exercise in its own right.
Well, I don't think that's really what I was trying to do in the paper. I mean, I wasn't precisely not trying to generalize about the Enlightenment. I was trying to illustrate tensions within it. So if I had a magpie method of quoting certain things, it was precisely to set it against something which is much more familiar to us. And to suggest that the tensions are there. It doesn't mean, I'm not trying to make an argument for one or the other. I'm trying to suggest that there are tensions in this moment, in this historical moment, in this historical thing that we label the Enlightenment. And when I invoked the Enlightenment myself, I was very specifically trying to talk about the Enlightenment as it is conceived today by people both who are criticizing it and by people who are defending it. So no, I don't think I would actually dispute your characterization of the talk.
So I have a very, very simple question. I'm thinking of two hats, and one hat is a king, and the other hat is a liberal democracy. And we're talking about sovereignty, going from one to the other. And we have all of these Enlightenment ideas running around, and you're going from the hat of the king to the hat of the democratic side. And in this context, the first question I have on a historian is there something in the Enlightenment that moves from the king to the hat of the liberal democracy? directly all of these ideas that are also good and new at that point. And then there's a question of instrumentalization within these two hats. One, you have a sovereign who has to be enlightened in order to enlighten the populace, I suppose, and to rule according to enlightened figures. And the other is you have to have a populace which is enlightened in order to set these ideas in gang, okay? So this is my quite very simple question, and I'd like to know from your point of view as a historian, is there some transition that takes place, and there are some transitions being pushed by the Enlightenment itself?
Well, again, I would say I would be reluctant to say that the Enlightenment is pushing anything. I can't resist joking that when you talk about the two hats, I would suggest that there's a third hat in between, which the French would call a bicorne, which is the hat of Napoleon Bonaparte. So it isn't a simple, which is just to illustrate the point that it's not a simple passage from absolute monarchy to liberal democracy. It is a long, drawn-out, difficult, bloody, frustrating, and still incomplete and threatened progress from one to the other. And what I was trying to suggest in the paper is that a lot of what we now consider the fundamental values that we want to defend in our society are precisely the values that have emerged over the course of these long struggles, and they didn't emerge from the head of Minerva, like Minerva from the head of Zeus in the Enlightenment breaking out of Europe at the time. Again, it's really to call. I think there's a wonderful essay by David Hollinger a few years ago, which about the ways that the Enlightenment has been studied, which really just called attention to this fact that too often when we start placing everything on the Enlightenment, we forget about everything that comes in between, and there's a lot that comes in between. We forget about when we talk about aesthetics, we forget about modernism, we forget about romanticism, we forget about a lot. We almost assume that Enlightenment happens and then the modern world is set in place. And I really don't think that as an historian, I just don't think that works. There are certain things, certain tendencies that, yes, are very important, that are begun in the 18th century, but there's a lot that happens to make that, to make the world that we live in and the values that I think most of the people in this room would see themselves as defending, and they're not the values of the 18th century.
Rainey.
Yeah, thank you very much. I entirely take your point about the distinction between the Enlightenment as a particular historical epoch and movement and the evolved senses, in the plural, of the Enlightenment. My question is why the distinction is necessary. Why is it that we are still calling very different entities, and both the foes and the friends are still calling it the same project of the Enlightenment, and not just within a European intellectual or even both South and North American tradition, but throughout the world? I'm sure you know the work of Sebastian Conrad about the global Enlightenment. And you would, of course, counter that each one of these will take its own form, and yet, we do not have people, for example, saying they are part of a continuation of the Baroque, for example, or that they are a continuation of the Middle Ages.
Exactly.
Except perhaps,
even the Renaissance.
Except perhaps as Chateaubriand. So there's something about this movement which lends itself, however misleadingly, to an assertion of continuity, and not just its proponents, but also its adversaries. Absolutely. Why do you think?
That is a great question. It's a really important question, and I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. I think, again, speaking as an historian, a lot of it goes back to, yes, the French Revolution, because, again, at the French Revolution, I mean, if the enemies of the Enlightenment were the first people to actually, come up with, with an image of something that sort of basically corresponds to the Enlightenment, the second people to do this were the French revolutionaries. Not only in reburying Voltaire and Rousseau in the Pantheon, but in creating a cult of all of these figures whom, in some cases they would literally carry their remains through the streets of Paris. Mably, who's largely forgotten today, but was also considered by them as one of the great philosophers. So already in the end of the 18th century, both the people who approved of what we would now call the Enlightenment and the people who opposed it were already saying, this is responsible for everything. This is responsible for all the major changes in the world, that have come with the French Revolution and everything that follows from it. So that's the beginning of it. There's also, I think, of course, there is a great desire, and I mean, these are debates among intellectuals, and intellectuals want to believe that the ideas can change the world. And which set of ideas are you going to look to? Well, I think this is clearly, again, these ideas coming just before, in such proximity to the age of revolution. It is so, it is so easy to think of the connection there. These are also ideas that come at the beginning of really the great age of European empire, inspiring, as a lot of enemies, quote, enemies of the Enlightenment would say. So I think it is overdetermined. I think it is overdetermined. I think it is also that for many of the people who would see themselves as defenders of the Enlightenment, there's so much that is actually problematic about so much that comes in between. So there's partly, of course, there's always, the myth of origins. You want some great origin to find. But then, you can go back to these often heroic figures who at great risk to their own life and limb were propounding ideas of toleration, of free speech, of, in many cases of democratic sovereignty and other things, incredibly admirable figures. So, of course, there's this desire to attribute everything to them. And then once that is done, it is the great contrarian move to then flip this a la Foucault or a la so many other people and say, no, what you were all saying is the beginning of everything wonderful, is in fact the beginning of everything terrible. So I do think that, it is remarkable the extent to which this has continued. It also is self-reinforcing. Because every time that somebody blames the Enlightenment, every time that Horkheimer and Adorno have a line like Enlightenment is totalitarian, a chorus of protest arises, and then it always comes back to the Enlightenment. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but at least maybe a partial answer.
Leah.
I have actually...
No, the mic's coming.
So I have actually two questions. One is in the spirit of it's even more complicated, and the other one is in the spirit of it's actually not that complicated.
Okay.
So it's even more complicated. It seems to me that your argument that there was no genuine pluralism but just toleration during the Enlightenment neglects the way in which the Enlightenment experience informed, for example, the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire in Europe, where principles of the Enlightenment were invoked exactly to overcome juridical fragmentation in exactly the kind of pluralist way that we now mean when we talk about multiculturalism and minority rules and so on. So it seems to me that the story that you're telling only applies to a certain way of thinking about the modern state, which doesn't generalize to either the Habsburg area or the Ottoman area, where the Enlightenment was really important. And the second question I have is, I wonder whether you can say a little bit more on the relationship between Enlightenment and commercial society. Because I think you're right that this problem that we start having with Enlightenment and colonialism and imperialism begins when the Enlightenment transitions from being a kind of mode of thought that is critical of power to being a mode of rule, which is sustained by a system also of economic distribution and political management of resources. But there it seems to me that if we're criticizing the Enlightenment for that, we're just barking up the wrong tree, because the problem there is simply imperialism and capitalism. It's nothing to do with the Enlightenment. And isn't it distracting to say that actually it's the Enlightenment that's the problem, and then we're not actually looking to what really is the problem and continues to be the problem, which is capitalism?
Thank you.
Okay, so on the first question, and to turn to the Habsburg lands and the Ottoman Empire, I'm not sure I agree with you in your characterization of this, because there is, on the part of these multinational states, there was always the necessity of tolerating a certain degree of difference because it couldn't be overcome so easily. There was also the idea of coordinating, the way in which these different groups would contribute to the empire in order to best serve the state. But I wouldn't agree that that this idea of pluralism was translated into a positive value. Certainly not for the ruler. Certainly not for somebody like, the Ottoman case I don't know as well, but for Joseph II, no. I really don't think so. There was a readiness to have the different nationalities of the empire and the different states within the sub-states within the Austrian Empire, do different things and coordinate their activities in different ways in order to serve the flourishing of the monarchy as a whole. But this was seen as taking advantage of of certain things that were there, and it wasn't for the benefit of the citizens, and it wasn't to respect their differences, it was to make use of their differences, which I think is a real difference there. When it comes to commercial society and capitalism, I mean, there are many deep connections, and actually, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a wonderful recent book by William Sewell about capitalism in the 18th century that actually points to some of the ways in which capitalism really advanced Enlightenment values. And I think, for instance, by creating ways in which creating situations in which people were interacting with each other as equals because they were equal in the marketplace. I would also argue that what we call the Enlightenment, particularly what I was referring to as the ideal of self-cultivation in the Enlightenment, goes very much hand in hand with the consumer revolution, because in the 18th century, for the first time, you have large publics at least in Western Europe, that we could call more or less middle-class publics, although it also extends into the ranks of shopkeepers and artisans and so on and so forth. And these are people who, for the first time in history, as a large group, have not only a degree of disposable income, but a large degree of products to choose from in their daily lives. And they are taking it, and whether it is products whether it is coffee and tea that they're buying, whether it is things that they're putting on their wall, whether it is household implements, in many, many ways they are actually have the ability to exercise a degree of choice that they hadn't been able to exercise before. They're no longer as constrained by guild rules, and so they are able to, in a sense, in a sense, curate their own lives. To use I'm not sure I like that phrase very much, but it'll suit. And as a result, And they're not doing this for the most part simply, for reasons of social betterment. Partly they are to look better than their neighbors or whatever. But partly they're doing it out of a real ideal of self-cultivation. They're buying books, whether they're religious books to make themselves better Christians, whether they are, books to improve their taste. They are buying engravings of people they admire to put on their walls. They're buying musical instruments. They're buying a lot of religious paraphernalia to help make themselves better Christians. So in all these ways, there is a kind of project of self-cultivation that the Enlightenment actually, to the extent that, again, that we can talk about it as a social phenomenon, that it really fits into. Because again, I mean, these authors are writing books that are meant to be read, but they're also writing books that are meant to be engaged with. So I think the relationship between the Enlightenment and capitalism is actually a very complex one. And that while we can talk about much of the ravages that capitalism has wrought upon the world, again, I'm not sure that when we talk about the expansion of European empire that we can blame, it's way too simple to blame that entirely on capitalism. So I think these are complicated things. I don't think, and I would stand by, the things I said about the actual effects of Enlightenment ideas as they came into the world. I think that, and again, I don't want to pose here as a post-colonial critic. That I'm certainly not. I disagree with those critiques wholeheartedly. But I do think we have to recognize that these values that we talk about today, when we put them back into the context in which they emerged in the 18th century, they were doing very different kinds of work.
David, I want to ask you a question. It follows directly up on what Leah said. So I'm on the complicated bandwagon.
Team
here.
complicated, excellent.
It's more complicated even than you said, because you neglected a part of the Enlightenment.
I only have 45 minutes.
There are this cluster of islands off the coast of Europe, and around those islands there was a thing called the Celtic Fringe, and it gave rise to a different kind of Enlightenment entirely.
Yes.
And it's very diverse. Now, if we think about Enlightenment ethics, we gravitate to Kant. But we have to remember also that roughly the same time, Jeremy Bentham is writing a very different kind of ethical theory, and he's reacting against another different ethical theory developed in Scotland by people like Hume and Smith. These are three major, very different ways of approaching a subject. Now, what's really interesting is that you said the Enlightenment is born in struggle. This is a context. But the Scottish Enlightenment doesn't seem to me. I mean, the peace has been made with the Church. The Church is Anglican. It has two positions on every issue, one for and one against. And so, it's mild. Smith gets brought down to London, and people, have him sit down and then stand up in sort of respect of him. So, I mean, and this is surely a place where you begin to see the intertwining of commercial society with the Enlightenment itself. And I agree with what you said. I mean, there are certainly tendencies in Smith that are both progressive and believe that the economy can be designed in such a way that we can work through it towards the values that he has, which may not be the same as, quite the same as other people. So I want to say, look, this picture becomes even more complicated when you don't just refer en passant to James Boswell and Adam Ferguson, but you actually bring these guys into the center of the Enlightenment. It's a different kind of Enlightenment, and I think it deserves a place in this in the conversation of this conference, which is why I'm going to talk about Adam Smith later on. But I just want to put that forward. I mean, I think Leah's right. I think much of what gets assigned to the Enlightenment is actually the product of the filtering of Enlightenment positions through capitalism, and in a way the distortion of the values of some of the Enlightenment people like Smith, who were very concerned to see capitalism. I mean, there's a very complicated story to be told here, and I think the idea that it all in the Enlightenment context is one of struggle. Well,
I will say, you know. If I had another talk to give, I would have definitely tried to introduce that other very important level of complication, because I agree entirely with everything you said there. I don't want to squeeze every Enlightenment. Again, I mean, the Enlightenment is a very complex thing, and we can't squeeze everything into it. So I would agree with that entirely. I think again one of the fascinating things in which I think actually does bring together a part of, for example, the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment, is the fact that is the reflection actually on society as a thing, on the reflection on social dynamics and society as a phenomenon which is actually separate from politics and separate from the state. Yeah, and so and I think the fact that and it goes back to a wonderful article that Nicholas Phillipson did many years ago, but the idea that the Scots have actually lost their sovereignty, and so they are sort of drawn not to be reflecting so clearly and obviously on matters of sovereignty and on political matters, but actually thinking about social interactions and social dynamics, which is actually not so far off from what certain French thinkers, particularly Montesquieu, are doing, because I think is absolutely right. And so yes, there is this other side, and the entire Enlightenment is not born in struggle, but a lot of it is.
There's one last question.
Yes,
it's over there.
Being an historian myself, so I won't add another question on complications, because that's a normal situation. The historian starts with some hesitating generalizations, and then at the end, the audience, even those not historians, add other aspects, and at the end, you must admit, yeah, they are. I would go to a central thing. I'm not convinced that your approach fits to the problem that we have here. We are speaking about the enlightenments of the 21st century, because that is something we are interested in. Then looking back, with all the complications, we have the difference in. Isn't it necessary to introduce the element of time? You said, there are this and that in the Enlightenment. The risk to go to enlightened despots. But the timing is essential. Before and after the revolutions, Enlightenment is other than before.
Yes.
And that is important. The moment when enlightened philosophers argue about what is going on in the French Revolution is a moment when there is no unity of enlightenment anymore. Take the case of Burke. As simple as that. I would come back to that, because if we think in terms of dynamics of a process of thinking, in new forms of thinking, isn't it necessary to link this kind of new thinking called enlightenment, the philosophe, to the really dynamics of the time? We have spoken of capitalist movement, so new forms of civil societies and so forth, and then the revolutionary forms of constitutions. Doesn't that make sense that we should think, because we, as ourselves today, have to, it's not the same situation of thinking enlightenment in 21st century, let's say about 2000 and 2020. Tribalism isn't all the same. So are we not forced, urged as historians to add to that debate in, introducing the element of timing?
I thought that's what I was saying. I mean, I really did think that what I was saying, and paying attention to the different contexts of the world we live in today and the 18th century, and simply to guard us against reifying something called the Enlightenment and suggesting that we can simply take its heritage as unchanged from the 18th century today. It's exactly what I was trying to argue.
Well, join me, please, and
Thank you. Thank you very much.